welcome back to our video series on the Renaissance in Italy. Today will be part 2. We'll be focusing in on the art movements of Italy at the time. Yesterday we had talked about the beginning of the Renaissance, specifically the philosophy, the idea of rebirth, and the idea of humanism. But today we will be focusing in on the artistic endeavors and artists of Italy at the time. Now, during this time, there was a lot of support coming from patrons of the arts, and as we established yesterday, the patrons were wealthy individuals, such as bankers and merchants, who were supporters of different artists and would give them money so that they could pursue their passions and create artwork. Some of these rich patrons also included the Pope and princes from around Italy. The popes and the princes would actually support hundreds of artists. In the case of the Catholic Church, they would commission the artists to create artwork for churches around Italy. We will speak later about the Sistine Chapel, which is one of the most famous works of Renaissance art that was commissioned by the Catholic Church. The art techniques of the time reflected the growing fascination in humanism in the Renaissance culture, specifically by combining famous religious figures such as Jesus and the Virgin Mary with classic Greek and Roman backgrounds and architecture. Artists at the time focused on developing their craft, whereas prior to this, during the medieval times and the Middle Ages, artists were less focused on the quality of the work and more focused on communicating a message. It was during this time that the artists began to experiment with things such as perspective and shading to try and create very realistic looking images. Perspective is the idea of giving something an appearance of depth. Objects that would be further away in a painting would be painted smaller in the background, and objects that were supposed to appear closer to the viewer would be painted larger in the foreground. Renaissance artists also experimented with shading. Now, shading is incorporating shadows and playing with the concept of light. This allows for artwork to look more realistic and three-dimensional. And to improve in their understanding of how to portray humans on canvases, Renaissance artists actually studied anatomy and the human body. It was during this time that female artists also began to rise in prevalence. We have to remember that during this time, women did not experience these same rights and freedoms that men enjoyed. So many female artists at the time, they would actually sell work under the names of their husband. However, despite this, there were some famous female artists at the time who would paint under their real name. One of those was Sofonisa Anguissola, who was actually an Italian noblewoman and was hired as the court painter for King Philip II of Spain. The fascination with humanism and Renaissance art also carried over into the architecture at the time. Prior to this time period, the common architectural style for the Middle Ages was actually the Gothic architectural style, which had more angular, pointy shapes incorporated into the architectural work. It was also much more busy, and a lot of Renaissance architects rejected this, claiming that it was too cluttered and disorderly. Instead, they copied classical Greek and Roman styles of architecture and incorporated many more columns, domes, and arches into their work. If you were to visit Italy today, you can actually still see examples of this Renaissance architectural style. And in the United States, we've even incorporated some of these classical Greek and Roman ideas in our buildings down in Washington, D.C. Now, while there were many great artists in Italy at the time, three of the most important ones were Michelangelo, Leonardo da Vinci, and Raphael. We'll first start with Leonardo da Vinci, who was one of the major geniuses of Italian art. So Da Vinci focused an emphasis on realism. He tried to make his artwork look as real as possible. And as we had mentioned, that meant working with shading and working with light, as well as understanding human anatomy and perspective. Now, aside from being a painter, Da Vinci was also a sculptor, an inventor, a musician, an engineer, and he also studied anatomy and botany as well. So Da Vinci was the first prototypical Renaissance man. And when you hear the term Renaissance man, it means a person who can really do it all and experiments in different mediums of artwork. Two of Da Vinci's most famous artworks are the Mona Lisa, which is the mysterious smiling woman that you can see in the Louvre in Paris today, as well as the Last Supper, which is a painting of Christ and the Apostles. The Last Supper is a perfect representation of Renaissance perspective and how the artist would play with distance to make something look more 3D and realistic. And we'll put up a few images of those artworks now. The second major Italian artist that we need to focus in on is Michelangelo, who was also talented in many areas and was also a Renaissance man. Now, Michelangelo's preferred medium to work in was actually sculpting, where he would create beautiful statues, but he was also a talented engineer, painter, architect, and poet. Three of Michelangelo's most famous artworks were the Pieta, which is a statue of Mary holding Christ after he died, the statue of David, which is the shepherd who killed Goliath in the Bible, and the Sistine Chapel, which was actually not a sculpture. The Sistine Chapel was a famous church in Italy. Michelangelo was commissioned by the Catholic Church to paint a mural on the ceiling and walls of the church, demonstrating different stories from the Bible. Interestingly, in order to paint this mural on the ceilings of the Sistine Chapel, Michelangelo had special scaffolding constructed that would allow him to lie on his back and look up at the ceiling while painting. And we'll put up a few images of his most famous artworks now. And the third artist that we should focus in on that was important for the Renaissance in Italy was actually Raphael. Now, Raphael had extensively studied the works of Da Vinci and Michelangelo, and notice how they utilized perspective and shading to make their work look realistic. Raphael really was a great representation of the Renaissance art styles, as he blended Christian and classical Roman and Greek styles together to create unique artworks. Two of his most famous works are the Madonna, which is a painting of the Virgin Mary, as well as the School of Athens, which is actually a fictional work. It is Raphael's imagining of what it would have been like for all of the greatest scientists and philosophers who have gathered together in Greece to discuss their ideas. And we'll show some of his famous artworks now. So that will wrap up part 2 of our series on the Italian Renaissance. In part 3, we will be focusing in on famous Italian writers who also contributed to the Renaissance movement.